headlines. Korea's local election candidates give a final push on the last day of their campaigning. Over 80% of the country's population is eligible to vote at over 13,000 polling stations nationwide. Korea's main exports to China shrinks more than 9% on year, the first monthly drop since February last year. And the U.S. Forces Korea says the U.S. is considering deploying its missile defense system in South Korea. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Kang Tae in Seoul. Thanks for joining us. Today is the final day of campaigning for candidates running in the local elections. By this time tomorrow, Koreans will have already cast their ballots and the vote counting will have begun. The results from tomorrow's local elections are especially important as they will be a litmus test for the Park Geun-hye administration in the wake of the April ferry disaster. Park Ji-won reports.
The country's rival political parties are engaged in one final push to win the hearts of undecided voters on this Tuesday, the last day of the 13-day campaigning period. These elections are increasingly being seen as a vote of confidence for the Park Geun-hye administration, with last month's tragic ferry disaster hitting the incumbent government hard. The ruling Saenuri Party is calling on the public to give them one more chance to revamp and reform the government in the wake of the disaster.
I earnestly plead with voters to give us strength and another chance so President Park could make a new Korea. Our party, by helping the president, will build a new Korea.
The main opposition, New Politics Alliance for Democracy, is calling on voters to hold the ruling party responsible for the government's poor handling of the tragedy.
The Saenuri Party is already asking us to forget about the Seoul ferry. They asked voters to forget about it and wipe the tears of the president by helping her. We'll never forget the Seoul ferry disaster.
Over 13,000 polling stations around the nation will open at 6 a.m. on Wednesday and close at 6 p.m. More than 11% of eligible voters already cast their ballots in early voting held late last week. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
A U.S. official has spoken publicly about Washington's desire to deploy a U.S. missile defense system in South Korea. While you might think the move has North Korean threats in mind, analysts say it actually has more to do with China's rise. Kim Hyun-bin has this report.
The top commander for U.S. forces in Korea has asked Washington to deploy an advanced American missile defense system in Korea, a move that may push Seoul closer to joining Washington's missile defense system, along with Japan. Speaking at a lecture in Seoul on Tuesday, General Curtis Scaparrotti said he had recommended that the Pentagon set up the system known as a Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, to Korea. Scaparrotti's comments are the first from a U.S. official that confirm it is looking into deploying its high-altitude defense shield on the peninsula. THAAD is a U.S.-led missile defense system capable of intercepting ballistic missiles at high altitudes of up to 150 kilometers in their terminal phase. Earlier reports said that Washington had conducted a site survey for possible deployment locations for the THAAD system. But is it a good fit for South Korea?
THAAD is very controversial regarding the efficiency and adaptability and interoperability. A lot of concepts we should consider.
Some experts say the U.S. is not using the system to prevent threats from Pyongyang, but rather to counter China's growing presence in the region.
It's still too early to say that China is all against the Chinese rising military power. We should focus on North Korea's direct missile system and its North Korea's very provocative actions, including the post-nuclear test and another series of missile tests.
The recommendation is in the initial stages of consideration. General Scaparrotti said a final decision will come after close discussions between Korea and the U.S. Kim Hyun-bin, ARIRANG News.
A former U.S. official says sanctions slapped on North Korea for its nuclear and missile activities don't really have the desired effect. Speaking at the Center for Strategic and International Studies on Monday, former U.S. National Security Advisor Tom Donilon said North Korea's isolated financial system means U.S. dollar sanctions don't do that much damage to the regime. He contrasted the situation in North Korea to Iran, which has a financial system that is closely interconnected internationally and also has a huge petroleum trade system. The chatter over a resumption of the six-party talks on North Korea's nuclear program has picked up in recent weeks, but the chief nuclear envoys of South Korea and the U.S. during their talks in Washington agreed that dialogues with Pyongyang will only begin once the regime shows it's ready to freeze its nuclear program. Hwang Sung-hee reports.
South Korea and the United States agreed North Korea must not advance its nuclear capability if it seeks dialogue with them. Following 4 hours of talks in Washington on Monday local time, South Korea's chief nuclear envoy Hwang Jung-guk and his U.S. counterpart Lynn Davies set a condition for the resumption of six-nation talks aimed at denuclearizing North Korea.
On resuming denuclearization talks, we agreed it must be a meaningful dialogue that ensures actual progress and prevents further development of North Korea's nuclear capacity.
The meeting comes a week after Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Seoul, where he called for a swift resumption of the six-party talks. The multilateral denuclearization dialogue involving the two Koreas, the U.S., China, Japan, and Russia, has been stalled since December 2008. Hwang said Seoul and Washington agreed North Korea's sincerity about denuclearization is the key precondition to resuming the six-party talks, and they will seek close consultation with Beijing on the issue. South Korea and the United States also called on Japan to maintain transparency in its discussions with North Korea. Pyongyang agreed last week to allow a reinvestigation into the fate of Japanese citizens abducted by the North in the 1970s and 80s, and Tokyo promised to lift some of its sanctions on the North. Experts say dialogue between North Korea and Japan is key for solving the abduction issue, but stress Tokyo must not stray away from its trilateral cooperation with Seoul and Washington in dealing with Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions. Hwang Sung-hee, ARIRANG News.
For the latest in news that impacts Korea and the world, join Kang Chae-ri for a lively half hour that covers politics, business, international news, and much more. Live at 8 every weeknight on ARIRANG TV.
D-1 Human Rights Council headquarters in Geneva on Thursday, finding ways to. Samsung is taking another step toward restructuring, and this one is being seen as another move to speed up the succession of ownership from the group chairman to his children. Samsung Everland, the de facto holding company of Samsung Group, says it plans to go public in the first quarter of 2015. Hwang Jie tells us more.
Samsung Everland will go public by next March. The de facto holding company of Korea's biggest conglomerate, Samsung, said Tuesday that it plans an initial public offering as part of efforts to become a global fashion and service company. The move, however, is widely seen by analysts as the next step in the conglomerate's succession plan as it relates to Samsung Electronics chairman Lee Gun-hee's 3 children. Currently, his son Tae-yong holds the largest 25% stake in Samsung Everland, while his 2 daughters, Poo-jin and Seo-hyun, each hold around an 8.5% stake. Chairman Lee holds a mere 3.7%. Analysts say the listing of Samsung Everland will give the chairman's children means to generate cash by selling shares in the company. The cash could be used to help pay inheritance taxes and buy shares in companies they want to control.
Samsung Group would need a lot of transaction costs in order to pay necessary taxes, in order to swap necessary stakes from one entity to the other.
Questions linger about Samsung's future as the group's de facto chairman Lee Keun-hee was hospitalized last month after suffering a heart attack. Many predict that the electronics and financial sector will be handed over to Lee's only son Tae-yong, the chemical and hotel sectors to first daughter Poo-jin, and the fashion and media sectors to second daughters Hoi-hun. Samsung Everland is expected to lay out a detailed schedule and procedures for the listing later this month. 황지혜, 아리랑 뉴스.
The jitters over an economic slowdown in China may be a bit premature. Recent data suggests that the country's factory and service sectors powered back in May with their best showings in months. HSBC survey shows that China's manufacturing PMI rose to a 4-month high of 49.4 in May, showing signs that the economy is stabilizing after a slow start to the year. The non-manufacturing PMI by the National Bureau of Statistics show further expanded in May, rising to 55.5. The concerned about the sluggish growth of the Chinese government has been accelerating infrastructure investment and state spending and have lowered the reserve requirements for some banks twice. But data from the month of May shows Korea's exports to China did not fare too well. It's causing Korean exporters to scramble to adapt and policymakers to chip in where they can. Kim Ji-yeon tells us more.
Korean exports to China plunged 9.4% in May on year due to an economic slowdown in the world's second largest economy. It's setting off alarm bells for the Korean economy, whose growth is heavily export reliant. Exports to China make up the greatest share at a quarter of Korea's total exports. What's particularly worrying is that a large chunk of Korean exports to China are in the form of raw materials or parts that are manufactured or reprocessed in China for re-exports to other countries. China increasingly shifting focus to domestic consumption from exports for its growth. The proportion of intermediate trade based on reprocessing dropped to 25% last year from 39% 6 years earlier. This is why Kang Do-yong of the Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade highlights the need to expand the range of Korean goods exported to China.
One of the best ways for Korean exporters to weather the storm is to begin producing goods that can be sold in the Chinese local market, rather than goods that are merely used for reprocessing.
To help Korea's export companies respond to the changing landscape, Korea's Trade Ministry is planning to step in. They plan to promote more marketing and export exhibitions through related organizations like the Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
The Korean cabinet has given the green light to an ambitious plan to cut back on the country's greenhouse gas emissions. The 5-year Green Growth Plan approved Tuesday seeks to reduce carbon emissions from the industrial sector by more than 56 million tons by 2018, starting this year when the target is 6.2 million tons. To accomplish the goals, a shift toward liquefied natural gas will be promoted within the refinery and steel industries. 200,000 electric vehicles will also be provided to cities across the country by the year 2020, and railway systems will be expanded as well. Korea is currently the world's 7th worst offender in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And a similar move in Washington, the Obama administration has also announced its boldest step yet to reduce the country's carbon emission from power plants. Our Choi Yoo-sun has the details.
But today EPA is proposing a clean power plan that will cut carbon pollution from our power sector by using clean energy sources and cutting energy waste.
The Obama administration's new plan requires America's 1,000 power plants to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions to 30% of 2005 levels by the year 2030. Nearly 2/5 of electricity in the U.S. is generated by coal-fueled plants. Each U.S. state has a number of ways to achieve this. They can increase their power plants' heat rates, rely more on natural gas or other sources for energy, and raise energy efficiency.
The Environmental Protection Agency says more than $90 billion of climate and health-related costs will be saved from the plan, and up to 150,000 asthma attacks in children and over 3,000 heart attacks could be prevented.
Often these illnesses are aggravated by air pollution. Pollution from the same sources that release carbon and contribute to climate change. We've got to do more to reduce it.
Despite the government's assurances that the new rules will bring down electricity bills by 8% and encourage investment in new technologies, business groups and lawmakers from coal-reliant states oppose the initiative.
The administration has set out to kill coal and its 800,000 jobs. If it succeeds in death by regulation, we'll all be paying a lot more money for electricity.
After a period of public comment, the regulations will be finalized in June of next year, after which states can submit their own carbon reduction plans. Choi Yu-sun, ARIRANG News.
LG Electronics and 3 of its affiliates have taken 12 airline companies to court over alleged price fixing. Legal analysts say the court's decision could open the door for similar lawsuits down the road. Shin Se-min tells us more.
LG Group companies are seeking hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation from a dozen domestic and foreign airline companies. The Fair Trade Commission said Tuesday that LG Electronics, LG Chem, and 2 of their affiliates filed a lawsuit against the airline companies late last year, and the case is currently being heard by the Seoul Central District Court. The 12 airline operators, including Korean Air, Asiana Airlines, Air France, and Cathay Pacific, are accused of colluding to maintain unfairly high freight transportation prices by fixing surcharges levied to make up for volatile fuel costs. The LG companies claim that the move hurt their competitiveness in export markets. The lawsuit seeks over $390,000 in financial damages, but experts say the amount of compensation may rise much higher depending on the amount of losses. If the airline companies are found guilty, many other exporters could bring about similar suits. Korea's Supreme Court recently ruled that penalties were rightly imposed on airline companies that collude to fix airfares. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
Voters in Syria have begun casting their ballots in presidential elections as a deadly civil war continues to rage across the country. For more, Paul is joining us from the news center. Paul, the conflict has torn apart the country, causing widespread poverty and millions of displaced residents. What does the government hope to accomplish with this election?
Well, many are seeing this snap election as a way for President Bashar al-Assad to consolidate his power over Syria and rally support against the rebels. But most Syrians say they're tired of the war and just want peace. Polling stations in Damascus saw a high voter turnout with banners and flags showing support for the current leader. Assad is running against 2 relatively unknown challengers who were pre-approved by parliament. It's the first time in half a century that Syrians have been offered a choice of any candidates. Insurgents stepped up attacks in the build-up to the elections, seeking to disrupt the vote. Syrian officials, however, say they'll push forward as a way to resolve the current crisis.
The big majority of Syrians feel that this aggressive crisis should end and that they must get out of what happened and that what was happening should not continue. The majority of Syrians are convinced that the key to the end of the crisis will be the presidential elections.
President Assad is widely expected to win a third 7-year term in office, but his opponents, including rebel fighters and Western powers, say the election is a sham. They say no credible vote can be held in a country where millions of people have been displaced and polling stations only set up in state-controlled regions. Syria's civil war is now in its 3rd year and has so far killed more than 160,000 people.
I see now Russia has called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council in response to the worsening violence in eastern part of Ukraine. Give us the details of the meeting.
Well, the 15-nation UN Council met briefly behind closed doors on Monday to discuss a draft resolution that was introduced by Moscow. The resolution called for the immediate halt of clashes against pro-Russian separatists who remain in control of a number of key government buildings. Vitaly Kurkin, Russia's permanent representative to the UN, said the large-scale military operation by Kiev had led to heavy shelling of residential areas and civilians being killed, among them women and children. Russia, which is the rotating Security Council president for this month, also called for humanitarian assistance to help those in need.
Our draft demands the immediate cessation of hostilities, urges parties to commit themselves to a sustainable ceasefire, and calls for the establishment by the parties of humanitarian corridors in order to allow the civilian population to live safely and to ensure humanitarian assistance.
Ukraine has slammed the draft resolution, calling it cynical and immoral. Kiev's UN representative Yuri Sergeyev accused Moscow of sponsoring terrorism and inciting the unrest in eastern Ukraine.
Now, the former U.S. intelligence contractor Edward Snowden has emerged from hiding once again to give an exclusive interview. Snowden has leaked some of the NSA's deepest and darkest secrets. Were there any new revelations this time around?
Well, there weren't any major revelations in this latest interview, but that doesn't mean the self-proclaimed ex-spy is sitting on more top-secret documents. Brazilian journalists had met with Snowden in Moscow for an interview that was broadcast on Sunday on Brazil's popular TV news program Globo. The 30-year-old rocked the intelligence world after leaking documents revealing massive surveillance programs run by the National Security Agency. Snowden's temporary asylum in Russia is due to expire in August, but when asked about whether he was willing to trade information for asylum in Brazil, he gave a firm no.
First off, I don't have any documents to offer. Secondly, even if I did, I would never trade secret information or cooperate with some government in exchange for asylum. Asylum has to be granted on humanitarian grounds. It has to be granted to protect political rights or the right to safety.
U.S. officials say Snowden is welcome to return to the United States if he wants to face justice, but it looks like he's not going home anytime soon. Snowden, who fled to Hong Kong and then Moscow last year, is believed to have access to about 1.5 million secret documents, although how many he actually took remains unclear.
I see. Now, finally, Apple has kicked off its annual developers conference in California. There's been a wave of new announcements from Apple. Can you give us a rundown on the first day?
Well, Apple began this year's WWDC with a special keynote in San Francisco on Monday morning, putting key executives like Tim Cook and Craig Federelli front and center. The U.S. tech company unveiled its newest operating systems for its mobile devices and computers, calling it the biggest release since the launch of the original App Store 5 years ago. Apple also showed off its newest mobile applications that analyze your health and also automate your home. They also released a new programming language called Swift, which they say will change the way how people develop software. Many developers from around the world were eager to work with the new tools.
Because we're developing apps to be able to provide you with, daily action plans and things to help you improve your health, and then tie that into device tracking. So that'll be a key piece of the application. So we really like the extensions piece and the health application.
Despite growing rumors of new hardware and product categories such as the highly anticipated iWatch and a larger iPhone, there were no announcements of such kind. We'll have to wait for those at Apple's fall keynote address or even next year. Charity?
All right, Paul, thank you very much for that update, and we'll see you back here in just about 2 hours. For an update on the weather conditions, our Po-kyung is joining us from the Weather Center. Po-kyung, two questions. When is the rain stopping, and are things looking better tomorrow?
Well, Teddy, it was raining when I woke up this morning, and we got to see rainy conditions all throughout the day before things cleared up about an hour ago. But some regions are still seeing rainy conditions at this hour. Well, today, a low pressure front from the West Sea is leading to overcast and rainy skies. Plus, we're looking at strong winds hitting regions along the west and south coast regions. A heads up for those of you in Gyeongsang-namdo province, because you may get to see 10 to 20 millimeters of precipitation per hour, and that may be accompanied by stormy conditions. Other than that, this latest round of showers will gradually come to an end by tomorrow morning, so no major problems heading out to the polls tomorrow. Taking a look at tomorrow's readings, expect a cloudy day in Seoul with daytime high reaching 28 degrees, while a mix of rain and clouds are in the picture for Daegu and Busan, peaking at 23 and 21. Taking a look at other places, Daejeon and Jeju hit the mid-20s, Dokdo and Mount Kumgang should make it to 20 degrees. And that's all the updates for now, but I'll be back with the latest after 10.
Po-kyung, thank you very much. And that will do it for this edition of ARIRANG News. Thanks for watching.